Welcome everybody. Welcome to this Ph.D. defense. I'm Professor Steffen Røbke. I'll be the moderator of this event. I would like to start by welcoming the assessment committee, which consists of Associate Professor Thomas Diesen, sitting there, who is the chairman of the committee, Associate Professor Valentina Cargiani from University of Bologna, and Special Consultant Lars Gerd Nielsen from DSB. Yes, and I would also like to welcome the PhD candidate Simon Bull and his supervisors Jesper Larsen sitting here and co-supervisor David Pissinger sitting next to. Yes, I'd of course like to welcome you all also to the PhD defense. Today we start by a 45-minute talk by Simon, where he will summarize his PhD thesis. The thesis was titled Efficiency and Robustness in Railway Operations, and that's the same title as the talk. The work has been carried out at the Department of Management Engineering here at DTU under the supervision of the two gentlemen over there, as I said. So now Simon will talk for 45 minutes, and after that there will be a short break. If you want to leave in the break, you're perfectly welcome to do so, but you can also stay and listen to the questions. So after the break, the committee will ask questions, and there will also be a chance for the supervisors to ask a question at the end. If you in the audience wish to ask a question, that's also a possibility, but you have to come and see me in the break, and there will be some time at the very end. This whole session can last 3 hours at the most, so at 4 o'clock we'll be done, no matter where we are. But it's perfectly okay if we finish before time, so you don't have to fill out the time committee. No need to do that. When you're done, you're done. Yes. After the defense, there will be a reception in building 426, I am sure, and the committee will announce the decision there. But I'll now give the word to Simon Bull. You have 45 minutes from now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Stefan. So yes, I'm Simon Bull, and I'll talk about my thesis, efficiency and robustness in railway planning. And I won't sort of go through everything in detail that's in the thesis, and rather try to give maybe an overview and focus on some detail, so sort of give a taste for some of the things. But in just a 45-minute talk, try to focus it a little bit. Right, but I'll go through the agenda. So I'm going to introduce the project, the PhD project, sort of maybe place it in context, what's going on in the department, perhaps the funding. It's actually a PhD project that's part of a wider project. So I'll sort of introduce that a little bit. I'll then dive into the line planning problem and go into that in some detail. And most of the talk will be taken up with this line planning and extend a little bit into something else. And then I'll touch somewhat briefly on a different depot matching problem in railway planning. And finally, a brief conclusion. So the bulk of the talk will be this line planning, but I'll let you know as things come along where we're at. All right, so firstly I'll say, even though the title is just about rail, it's really about passenger rail. So I should say that straight away. It's not as general as rail overall, but it's passenger rail transport. So passenger rail has a lot of nice features. We can move a lot of people kind of rapidly with passenger rail. It's relatively energy efficient. So certainly, electric trains and also diesel trains per passenger kilometre use far less energy or far less fuel than petrol or diesel cars or even electric cars. But of course that's dependent on the number of passengers in the train vehicles. If there's only one passenger in an enormous train, then it's very inefficient. But it's something that's facing increasing demand, not just in Denmark, but in this PhD we're looking mostly at Denmark, but also worldwide. There's more demand for all sorts of transport, including passenger rail transport. And that brings with it some challenges, how to make sure that what the current systems and the systems of the future are able to satisfy those passengers as they'd like to be transported. So what are some challenges in planning for rail or passenger rail transport? One thing there is that there's this divided responsibility. So, of course, the government has some involvement in how trains are planned and what incentives there are for train operators, but the actual operators of passenger trains are, in some cases, competing with each other, and they're distinct from the network manager. Say in Denmark, there's DSB is the main operator in most parts of the country, and then there's Bain Denmark that is responsible for the infrastructure. There's also a traffic authority. So there's sort of different entities that have different responsibility. So there's a challenge in making sure that they somehow work together. Then there are things like punctuality, reliability, and these are things that maybe passengers expect. And certainly if passengers have their own car and they're considering, should I take the train, they're very concerned with the punctuality of trains. Are they going to be on time? And what's going to happen in unusual situations. So if there's a snowstorm, if you're a passenger with your own car, you kind of know what's going to happen. You might have some difficulty, but it's your responsibility. But when it's somebody else's responsibility, you want to have some assurance that it's going to be okay. And there are many other challenges, of course, for the planning of rail transport. So this PhD is part of a bigger project called Robust Rails, and that stands for, or is short for, Robustness in Railway Operations. So it's been an interdisciplinary project with PhD students from D2 Management, 2 students from D2 Transport, which is now part of D2 Management, but also a student from D2 Photonic and somebody from D2 Compute, who've looked at rather different things from what I'm going to be looking at. But one of the things that Robust Rails has been considering is coming up with new methods for creation of rail plans and the assessment of railway plans, but also a whole lot of other things that are not touched on here. And say, for example, D2 Photonic, of course, has very different concerns than D2 Management Engineering. And a quote that I got from the Robust Rails information page is that in Denmark, rail institutions are among Denmark's most criticized institutions. So that's maybe the starting point for D2, or for Robust Rails, the project here. So there's definitely some challenges in making sure that that's not necessarily the case. Maybe the rail transport is not something that the average person thinks just doesn't run well. But I'm actually the last project in Robust Rails, so there's the sort of wrapping up of the project. So if we look at how rail is possibly planned in different countries or by different organizations, there's sort of a sequence of problems from the very long term with a long time horizon to the very immediate and even on the day, the recovery. But I have considered mostly, this doesn't work, but line planning, the second line there, and a little bit of timetabling, and something on rolling stock planning with another student, Jørn, who was another Robust Rails student, and then he is focused on a lot of rolling stock planning, but especially the recovery, disruption management of rolling stock. And then outside D2 Management, the other Robust Rails students have sort of been very different areas, but you could put them into this picture somehow, but with a very different sort of methodology behind what they're doing. Okay, so one thing to know here is that there's sort of different stakeholders in railway transport. So there's obviously the passenger, and passengers obviously have concerns that are very relevant to them, such as their own travel time, and the punctuality of trains that they're going to catch, and the service level provided. So maybe at their station, where they get on and where they're going to, they would love there to be an intercity connection, say. They'd also love for there to be regular trains, not one train an hour, things like that. But it may not be justified because they're the only passenger at that station. And the operator has many concerns, some similar, some not. So they may be concerned with ticket revenue. So of course, if nobody wants to catch their trains, then nobody's going to be paying to do so. They care about some sort of operational costs, so they have to provide some service and it costs something. And then maybe they have some contingency costs that they think is relevant. That could be linked to punctuality. Maybe to ensure that things run smoothly, they have higher operational costs than they might otherwise have. And then the public in general, say through the government, can impose requirements on the train operators, and they might have very different concerns again. They might wonder about the future growth of Denmark. Where should stations be? Where do my voters want an intercity stop? Things like that, that don't necessarily, or aren't necessarily justified by the current passenger numbers or the operational environment. But we're going to say we're going to look especially at the passenger. So how can we think about maybe the passenger, and we want to think a little bit about maybe robustness, especially in robust rails, things like punctuality, and not so much about the public at all, in the sense of the government's associate or involvement with the rail operators. But we're going to say, yeah, our goals for this project are that we want to apply operation research methods to passenger railway planning problems. And yeah, we want to include the passenger somehow. We want to have maybe a passenger consideration in what we do, something about robustness, and we want to think a bit about the integration of different planning problems somehow. Maybe actually integrating problems in terms of planning, but maybe also thinking how does one influence the other, and what is sort of the cost of having it done separately. So that concludes the introduction there, and then I'll get into this line planning problem that I said I'd talk about. So what is line planning? So with a sort of concrete example here of a city line plan, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, the S train. You have different routes in an infrastructure network, different stopping patterns along those routes. You have some sort of regularity of all these different routes, and maybe you have some sort of different service type. So you decide along this route, stopping at these stations, there'll be this type of service. So in wider Denmark, you can imagine there's intercity trains and there are regional trains, and they might run along the same tracks in the same direction, but with different stopping patterns, and they're offering a different service somehow. And I think there are many different models and methods in the literature, and I put a literature review there by Anita Scherbel, and there you can see there are maybe, or you could categorize things in two main ways, taking a passenger focus or an operator focus. And I think many of the different models that you see, they're really distinguished by their objective function. What are they wanting to model? And that then has implications for the model itself. And that's sort of why there's so many, there's not necessarily agreement in what a line plan should be, what should be measured in a line plan. And we're going to take a bit of a passenger focus here. So, and it is going to be a case study looking at Copenhagen's S-train network. So just for the existing plan, there are 7 lines. In this example here, this is sort of a real example. I don't know if it's exactly what's operated today, but it's very close. And there are 85 stations, and they service, or it services 350,000 passengers every day. And one feature that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which is slightly unusual, is that the trains are all kind of homogeneous. They're all the same. There's not intercity S-trains and regional S-trains or anything like that. Of course, it's all within the city. But there are still trains that skip a lot of stations. They're sort of offering a faster service along certain pieces of track, and some that stop everywhere. That's how it operates now, but that isn't necessarily how it operates. We would say that there's a stopping pattern for each of these lines. And it could be that there are 2 lines in parallel that stop at alternative stations, for example, which may not be so handy for the passengers, very confusing. But it could certainly be that maybe between the city and Lyngby, there's one train that stops everywhere, and then after that it skips many stations, and the other line does the opposite. So there are these sort of mixed stopping patterns, and that adds a lot of complexity to the problem because, of course, there are many possible stopping patterns, even for a fixed route. And even though it seems somewhat similar or simple, there's more routes perhaps than you might expect because there are more end stations than are used right now. So, for example, Lyngby station, which is right here, can be an end station, but it's not used like that now. But in our modeling of the problem, we will include this possibility. And there are other end stations. So a route is really a selection of 2 end stations, a route between them, which is normally implied by those 2 end stations, and then a stopping pattern of some sort. So yeah, what is a line? Yeah, it is a route. It is a stopping pattern. We're going to assign to that an hourly frequency. And perhaps for the real S-train problem, you should think about the type of rolling stock unit. So there are 2 types, and they can be put together in different compositions. But we're sort of going to abstract that away a little bit. So not worry too much about that and make some assumptions on the feasibility of the resultant plan. But maybe for a more accurate modeling of the problem, you should make sure that you are not going to have a plan that requires all one type of composition, which there are not enough of or something like that. So just an example here, yeah. So you could have the same route, same end station to end station, but with different stops along the way. And if you allow any arbitrary stopping pattern, then there's an enormous number of these. So here, there are just 4 intermediate stations. So yeah, for every station you could pick, do we stop here or not? So there's an exponential number of these different stopping patterns. And we're not going to include all of them. We're going to have some restriction on what we do include. But the line plan then that we're going to come up with is a set of lines from that pool. It's going to have capacity for all passengers. It's going to meet various operational and contractual requirements. And then the last one, it's going to be timetableable. So we should be able to create a timetable for it. But just going through these in a little bit of detail, so there's a minimum and maximum number of trains that visit every station every hour. So you can't just not stop at a station, and you can't have many, many trains at every station. And each station has a different limit. Some of those terminal stations have requirement or limits on how many trains could stop there. Like Lungbu Station, as I said, it only has one turning platform. It doesn't have any depot, so it can't turn as many trains as maybe Hillerød or something, a bigger station with more platforms and a big depot. And there's going to be some track limits, and also some things like direct connection between particular stations need to be considered. But again, that last point about it being timetabled, that's maybe the most challenging to include in the line plan here, and the thing that we struggle the most with, perhaps. But first I'll say what's something that we're concerned with, and that's, from the passenger point of view, switching train. Switching train is kind of unpleasant. You know, it takes some time. So if you arrive on one of these trains and you're going to one of the others, then there's definitely some time involved, and that time somehow depends on the service level of maybe, or the frequency of the train you're switching to. It could also depend on the frequency of the one you're coming off. And it could really depend on the timetable, of course. If it's perfectly timetabled so that these arrive at the same time and wait for everybody to move onward, then that's great. But if your train arrives just after the one you want left, then you have to wait for a long time. But there's also some just risk of missing a connection, and it's just kind of unpleasant to have to stand up off your seat, walk out, and sit down again. So we sort of want some fixed penalty for the switching, but also some estimate of how long you might wait. So yeah, the modeling requirements here, we want to assign a cost to the switching that depends on frequency. And we also want some sort of fixed component to that. In the S-train network, we need frequency-specific, or line-specific frequency possibilities for each line. So you don't have sort of arbitrary frequency. You can't operate a line at 1 per hour, or 1.5 times per hour, or 5 per hour. Every line is going to have fixed frequencies that are valid, and you can only choose those. And for the passengers themselves, we want them all to travel from where they want to go to where they come from to where they want to go. So we have data for all these demands, and we want them all to somehow select their best route in the resultant line plan, subject to some sort of shared capacity. So I'll run through just a basic model that is not yet including the passengers. So just to say, what constitutes a valid line plan? What is a line plan? So firstly, I'll say for every line, we're going to have just a binary variable. Rather than modeling it with, say, a decision variable that tells you the frequency, we're going to have a binary variable to capture these kind of discrete frequencies. For each line, we have a set of these frequencies. And you can only pick at most one of those. So for example, if a line could operate at 1 time per hour or 2 times per hour, you can't pick both of those to make it 3 times per hour. It's only allowed if it's really explicitly in the data. And then these next 2 constraints, we're going to have upper and lower bounds on sort of generalized sets of lines. So for example, and that might be at Lungbu Station again, there must be no more than 6 trains per hour, say. So in this case, we would have all the lines that stop at Lungbu, and we would have a upper limit of 6. And we're multiplying by frequency there. So it's just how many trains per hour at various things, but it could also be terminal stations, tracks, these direct connections, so they can all be modeled in that way. But then this second to last line here is the only consideration we have for the timetableability of the line plan. And what we're going to do there is make sure that any sort of partial solutions that we somehow know are bad for timetabling will not be permitted in the solution. So this is potentially a very weak way to model this. So we're potentially going to find a solution, a full solution, with many lines and see that it doesn't work, so let's forbid that solution. And of course, there's potentially many, many constraints like this, but perhaps we can generalize it a little bit and say these 2 lines are never going to be valid together, so we can't pick both of them. Or it could be that these 3 lines don't work together. But we're going to have a set of those to start with, some of them that we've deduced by the running times of the lines, but others that we've just been told by DSB that doesn't work. And it's going to be a bit iterative to see, is this solution valid? No, it's not. What about this one? But it's not really a foolproof way of doing this, and it doesn't really kind of capture the true essence of what's going on. Why are they not timetableable? But just to say, what about the passengers? So we're going to have some graph where we can capture this traveling between stations on lines, because the travel time is relevant for the S train. This whole thing where you save time by skipping stops. And we also want this switching, fixed component of the switching and this frequency-dependent component. So we're just going to model them as a non-integer variable. In fact, this is just a network flow. Rather than a path, certainly a single path for each passenger, or for each origin destination. We're going to allow them to be split, but it's going to be a network flow from their origin to all their destinations. And we're going to link those flows to line decisions somehow. And I won't go into the details of any of the rest of this, but just say there's a flow conservation for every origin. It's like a multi-commodity flow. But the graph itself, we have two. So here we've got like a station with 2 lines visiting it. Every station has 3 vertices here. Where you arrive at the station, you can board a line and then travel on that line. You can arrive at the station on a line and leave it. Or you can arrive at the station, move to the platform, and then pay one of these costly red edges where we model the different frequencies for the line. So there's one edge for every frequency. And when we link these decisions, we either link them to these traveling edges, which are somehow frequency agnostic, except the capacity is frequency dependent. But these are frequency dependent. So if you're going to board a line that's at 3 times per hour, you have to use the more costly 3 times per hour edge than the 4 times per hour edge or the 5 times per hour edge. Only one of those is going to be present, and that's also linked to the presence of the line in the solution. All right, so and what about the objective? So we might say there's the travel time on trains. There's a fixed penalty for switching. So that can be all captured in that graph there. And there's a wait time estimate that's proportional to the inverse of frequency. So if the train operates at 2 times per hour, then the penalty is going to be proportional to half an hour. So in the worst case, it would be half an hour. In the best case, it could be much lower. And we're going to set it to around a half. But it's a bit of a parameter there. But really, for passengers, we just have this graph where we can assign a cost to every edge. And then we just have these decision variables, how much flow is on that edge for each origin. And then for the operator cost, because we just have these binary, this line at this frequency, then we can, of course, have a cost that's either calculated by us or given to us by the operator, or maybe calculated from parameters that we have from the operator about the unit type and the running time and the station visits maybe have different operating costs. And we just model that as a coefficient. So kind of these 2 objectives, and we really want to minimize both, some sort of trade-off between them. But I won't go into exactly how we might consider those, but I'll just jump to a bunch of solutions that we can come up with. So here we want to minimize both passenger cost and operator cost. So you want to be sort of down in this part of the graph as much as possible. But here we've come up with a sort of an interesting range of solutions, many of them kind of sitting close to some frontier of being non-dominated considering these, and then a few outliers that happen to be good for other objectives, because there are actually other considerations, other KPIs we might have. But we thought this was a kind of interesting set. And here in black, I've marked a real solution. So one of the line plans that has been operated in the past. I think there are 3 real solutions in here, but this is the best of those. I think this one is also a real solution. But then we can also say, well, one of them here is the best for the operator. So remembering we're trying to minimize operator cost, this is the best for that measure. And this one here is the best for the passenger. But you can actually see that of all these interesting solutions, everything here is better for the passenger than the real solution. And everything here is better for the operator than the real solution. And there are even a few solutions here that are better for both. But of course, we've got to remember that these might not be truly feasible, and this is also for our modeling of those operator costs and the passenger costs. And both of those are estimated costs. But at least here it seems like there's quite a range. But it is interesting that the real solution is not sort of too extreme. It's maybe reassuring that we see that it's somewhat in the middle. But there are a lot of different ways that we could have a think about these solutions. But I thought a couple that are interesting are maybe what proportion of the cost, or what percentage of the cost of a solution is coming from the switching. That's both the variable cost of switching and the fixed cost. So if I take all those solutions and sort them by this percentage, then it's always a small proportion. It's between 8% and 14%, but there's quite some variation in different solutions. And it is the case that the real solution, again, sits kind of in the middle. So if we call the real solution was relatively average here, and it's also relatively average here. And again, visiting those other solutions, we see that indeed the green solution, which was the best for the operator and then relatively bad for the passenger, has a very high percentage of its costs coming from switching. And similarly, the solution that's best for the passenger has a small percentage of its costs coming from switching. So you might suggest then that maybe switching is where all the cost is coming from to the passenger, that the switching really is very indicative of the overall cost. Noting, of course, that this is the percentage of the cost, not the total cost, or not the absolute cost. But actually what we find is that, and it's maybe unusual in the S-train case, but the travel time, the difference in different travel times and different line plans is very relevant. Because when you have those skipped stations, even though you only save a small amount of time per station that you bypass, there are many passengers on that train, or if it's a good plan, then there will be many passengers who want to take that train, and they all save a small amount of time, so that actually becomes a very relevant saving. And if you didn't think that was relevant at all, of course, you might come up with a line plan that does not skip any stations. And then you could actually really minimize the number of switchings overall, because no one would ever have this problem where their station is not stopped at by all the lines they might like to use. But in fact, this turns out to be relatively poor solutions, at least by this measure, because they miss out on that saving. But if we just run through that in maybe slightly more detail, so there's what percentage comes from the travel time, and it sort of matches as 91% or 85%, so that corresponds to that between 8 and 14 for the percent switching cost, and we can break that down by these two components. Switching costs consist of the fixed amount and the estimated time based on switching. And these are both kind of weighted. So there's a weighting on the fixed cost. Well, it's just a made-up number, basically. It's sort of a penalty. And that could be changed. And there's also a weighting on this, or a parameter that says what percentage or what proportion of the headway do you weight. And again, you see that, a small proportion can come from this, but it can be up to 8.7% from the fixed switching cost, only 6% from the estimated switch time. You might wonder, are these two even both relevant, or should you only have one? Is there any connection between them? Or is it really relevant how you weight those? How sensitive are the solutions to that? And just looking at those two, if we say, now not looking at the percentage of the solution that comes from those, but the absolute cost of switching in a solution as a weight versus switching as a just fixed penalty. Surprisingly, there's not really any correlation at all between how much you switch or how much you pay for just switching and how much you pay for waiting for your next train. But for example, if you say, you obviously want both of these to be low, so maybe these solutions here, they're both relatively low, and here they're both relatively high. But say a solution here would be one where there's a low estimated time for switching. So that sort of means the passengers that do switch are switching to high-frequency trains, so they pay less. But on the other hand, the fixed cost of switching is high, which is indicative of there being many passengers who have to switch. And in contrast, a solution that would be up here would be sort of the opposite. Not many passengers have to switch. So there's a low fixed switch cost, but those that do switch are kind of paying a high cost. So these are both kind of relevant, but how relevant they are maybe is dependent on the exact problem. And how these are weighted is very influential on how the solution kind of stacks up one versus the other. But in general, in line planning, there are many other metrics we've come up with and thought about and how they're related to each other. But we think for the S-train network, there's travel time and the switching are both very relevant. For the operator, we have sort of a cost, but it's not so clear. But it comes from several sort of parameters that we have about lines. But there are a few problems here, and really say a lot of them are about the timetable. So is the timetable that we come up with feasible? And even if it is feasible, is it good? Or could it be that this line plan can only have bad quality solution or timetable solutions created for it versus another similar plan that could have better solutions for the timetable? And we could also wonder, what about the parameters that we estimated? Those are these switching times, and there's also the cost the operator cost. That's really an estimate, of course, once you know the timetable, and especially once you know the rolling stock and crew plans, then you could really know. But before that, it's all just a bit of an estimate. So we're going to sort of try to address some of those with some sort of integration of timetabling. So maybe create a timetable and see how does this line plan compare to this other line plan. And we'll say integration, but it's not like a full integration as one model. But we'll get to that. But just I'll first say, what does timetabling in the Australian network kind of look like? So if we look at the network itself, there's three interesting features, as you could say. So there's this round line here, and that doesn't really interact with any other lines. So here, 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 and here, there's no interaction at all. And it's only here where there is some interaction, and where there's sort of some platforms that could be shared. But that's for the current plan. But in our pool, of course, we actually have lines that go up. They continue up here from this round line, or they continue up this way to Lumbu or Holte or all the way to Hillrod. So there is some interaction. But in this part of the network, there's no interaction at all. But then every other line goes through this red central section. And in most line plans, we're going to see that there are 30 trains per hour in this central section. So in terms of timetabling, that's a challenge. So there's 1 minute minimum headway between trains. And so with 30 trains an hour, they're quite tightly packed. And we probably don't want them to all be just at their 1 minute headway and then there's big gaps. We'd rather they were a little more balanced throughout the hour. And then the final feature is that up in these sort of fingers of the S-train network, even though it might seem relatively simple, there's actually this problem where because we can have lines that skip many stations and other lines that don't skip many stations, that stop everywhere, there's a problem where one line tends to catch up to another line. So it imposes some problems or some strict limits on how far apart they can be. So suppose there's a fast, like a skipping line leaving here and a slow line, then the slow one should leave right after the fast one so that the subsequent fast one has a long sort of headway to catch up on it as it approaches the center. But then that sort of implies that they're both going to arrive at the same time here. And if they're both going the same way, still one fast and one slow, that's a problem. Whereas if they kind of change, then it's better. But it's certainly better if in these fingers they are more homogeneous. Maybe they both stop and skip alternating stations. But then that is not such a good solution for the passenger, not just by our measure, but probably in reality. Very confusing if you need to know exactly which line stops at which stations. But an overview of what we're going to do here is that we're going to generate a line plan to start with. And what we're going to do is we're going to create some optimal timetable for some measure of how good a timetable is based on the buffer between trains. So we want it to be sort of well buffered, not too many trains that are very close to one another, right at that minimum headway. We're going to identify some sort of beneficial line adaptions from that timetable. And then we're going to modify the line plan, but we can't really do that by hand because there are a lot of considerations that are hard to sort of imagine. So we're actually going to come up with some neighborhood of lines based on that identified line or lines that should be changed, or based on those identified adaptions, and solve a new line planning problem that comes up with a similar plan. And we can actually play a bit with how far we go with this, how many changes are we going to make. So we could actually take a big step, or we could just make very minor changes at once. But kind of in graphical form, we could say, we have two separate kind of models. And from each one sort of sees the other as a black box. So we have a line planning model, and it creates a feasible line, or feasible line plan for timetabling. The timetable identifies some lines that are sort of critical and should be changed in some way. And the line planning model returns some modified line plan. And so from the timetable point of view, from the line planning point of view, the timetable model is like a black box. You provide a line plan and it tells you is it good or what should change. And similarly, the timetable model sees this black box where it solves the timetable and it says this should change, and it gets back something that has those changes implemented. So it's certainly not an integrated model, but doing it in this way means we can sort of drop in, say, a different timetable model. Maybe DSB already creates timetables, or they do create timetables, or a different line planning model with an existing timetable. And so I'll just say, what sort of adaptions are we thinking about? So if we identify a line and we think it should change, we might say this line has too many stops in it. It needs to somehow slow down, or it needs to speed up, sorry. It needs to skip a bit more. So we might have these three different possibilities. So it could be that we drop both of them. We don't stop at either of those, but we add a stop here, or we could just not stop there, or we could not stop there. And there could be other possibilities. And on a line with many, many stops, there could actually be a lot of different similar lines. But that's not the only changes we're going to have to make, because actually other lines that run in parallel to this might also need to be changed, both to ensure that it's feasible to actually create a new line plan, but also because it might actually be better for the passenger. So we're going to sort of identify at least one line that's going to change, and then many other lines that are similar, and we're going to have alternatives. And I think the really important thing to note here is that our original line plan came from a pool of lines. But here, we're not going to bring these in from the pool. We're going to create these that are not in the pool. So potentially, we're going to come up with line plans that were not in the original pool at all. Maybe none of the lines in the plan were from the pool. But at least they should be, if we don't take too many iterations here, they should still be similar to the lines in the pool. So it's maybe a way of finding plans that are a little bit outside the pool, but they're just better for timetabling. And so as a case study, we took 10 line plans here, and 3 of them were real DSB line plans, and then 7 we selected somehow. So in 8 of the 10 cases, we can improve the buffer time by our timetable measure. So the timetable was trying to optimize some measure based on the buffers. And we were able to improve 8 of them. 2 of them we weren't. Of course, we don't always expect that we can. Maybe it's the case that it would take many iterations and our stopping criteria is too strict. But it could also be that that buffer is already optimal. Because in the line plan, so in the S-train network, there's only these 30 trains per hour. There's the 1 minute headway. So you can only sort of increase the minimum up to 1 minute in that region, in that part. But we've also improved the operator cost and the passenger cost in some cases. And that might be surprising, because the kind of way we've imagined this problem is that we're going to pay some cost in operator cost and passenger cost to improve the timetable. And the reason that we can actually improve these as well is that we're stepping away from our pool. So we're allowing lines that maybe were actually better for the passenger or for the operator than the ones in our pool, but we didn't have them in our pool originally. But that isn't really the intention. In general, we expect these both to become worse. And then the final thing that we can do in this case study is actually validate some of those estimates from the line plan. And especially we can validate how long passengers really wait for switching. So we can say if passengers, according to the line plan, they pay this much and they switch here, but in reality, if this is the timetable, how much would they really pay for switching? And we see that it's actually very close. Although, of course, in some cases, passengers get a very good connection, some they get a bad connection, but overall it kind of ends up being very similar. So now I just have a big table, but run through it very quickly. But there are the 3 types of line plan. So actually 2 of them were handmade. Those are ones that we thought would be good for timetabling. And then 5 of them here, we found them originally with the line planning model with slightly different parameters. And then you can see here that none of them take that many iterations. So that's maybe a good thing. So it's not something that takes a long, long time. So we have this kind of coarse integration, but we don't take that many iterations. Here I'm reporting the buffer improvement, but not the buffer improvement that the actual timetable model is using, but actually a separate assessment of the overall kind of buffer time. So it's slightly different, but then the operator cost and the passenger cost generally increase. And you can see, if you see, for example, this row 5, we improve this buffer. Here, a lowering of the buffer is actually a good thing, but we're paying 4.9% in operator cost and also something in passenger cost. But that's after 7 iterations. So you might say, well, 7 iterations, this has improved a lot and this has got a lot worse, but maybe after 6, there's a bit of a trade-off. So we actually get a sequence of solutions that are somehow sequentially better for the timetable and worse for the operator and worse for the passenger. Sort of up to the operator to decide which one of those is better. But I think we can see we can relatively easily improve the buffer time of a timetable to start with. And actually some of these timetables were kind of almost infeasible. So they had really no kind of buffer time between trains in many cases, and we could sort of improve those substantially. So if we say, what are we really doing here? If we ignore the part about the timetabling, it is some sort of heuristic exploration of pools of lines that are not in our pool. So we started with a line plan from a pool of lines that were maybe definitely okay for the operator. But now we're stepping into this sort of huge realm of lines that are not. Like I said, with those many, many stopping patterns, we haven't considered all of those in our line pool. And we could also do that without the timetable at all. We could just say we want to improve the operator cost. Here's an initial plan. Can we take some steps like this and improve it? And we can also do that for operator cost. And what we can actually see is that we can actually come up with slight improvements, but still with plans that do not vary too much from the pool lines. The good thing about the pool lines is that they're kind of already approved by the operator, whereas non-pool lines maybe are not so good. But we don't vary too much, but we can still make some improvements. But what we actually see with this is that pool line, the pool lines are kind of relatively good. So maybe there's not that much value in doing this. But on the other hand, what we could see is that perhaps if there are some changes that we always see, or some lines that are not in the pool that keep coming up in different solutions, we could ask the operator, could these be pool lines? But I think maybe there's some more work to be done, because this pool is relatively small compared to the huge number of lines you could have with these exponential number of stopping patterns. So we could do a little bit more there. But I'll say that's the end of the line planning part for now, and now I'll move on to this depot planning relatively briefly, or depot matching. And the context for this was this Euro Challenge 2014, this RODEF challenge. And this was all about planning the operations at some very big station. So this is a station with 20 platforms, and we have arrivals that could come from here. There's a sort of an entry to the system, or here. And then there are maintenance facilities here and here, lots of single tracks. These are long single tracks that you can sort of stack trains into. They have to come out in the order that they went in. And then just sort of abstract depots where you can park trains and bring them out without worrying about the order. So they've sort of simplified the infrastructure a little bit with some of these depots, and then these single tracks you have to treat more carefully. But the problem itself is that you have all these arrivals, all these departures. The arrivals have different categories. They have maintenance requirements, and you're going to match them to departures. Then based on those matchings, you'll know, should the train go and park somewhere for half an hour or for 6 hours? Will it need to go to maintenance? Will it need to be decomposed? Maybe this is several units stuck together and we need to pull them apart and then each maintained differently and then put together with other trains. And it all needs to be routed in a conflict-free way in quite complicated infrastructure. This is just one example, but each of the instances that we were given have different infrastructure. So what we did here is, I think the interesting part is that we pulled out this kind of sub-problem that was embedded in this full problem, and this was the matching. Simply saying, here are the arrivals and here are the departures, and how do you match them together? And what we can do with that is track the maintenance, the train category, throughout this long 7-day horizon. And something interesting here is that when you send a train off on a departure, it actually comes back again later in the horizon. So when you maintain it is kind of relevant. You might have a train that visits the station several times in the horizon, and it's going to need maintenance before its last departure. But whether it's on the first visit or the second visit or the third visit is sort of up to you. So what we can actually do by solving it like this is actually balance that workshop load. We have these different maintenance facilities. We can kind of balance their load throughout the horizon. And in terms of the challenge itself, the objective that we use here is kind of directly interpretable in the context of the challenge. So we can model some parts of the true objective function in this matching. So we get a bound on the overall objective function. And then in addition to that, of course, we had a full solution to the full problem. But because it was only a 10-minute time limit, it's hard to have anything too advanced. And I think a single model for the whole problem would be impossible. So we have some sort of heuristic framework for this matching, platforming, the routing through the infrastructure. And we won a prize. It was the second Ph.D. prize, I should say, the second Ph.D. prize for the challenge. So it was a very hard challenge. And I think this sub-problem we pulled out could actually show that it was quite hard, because the sub-problem itself was very, very difficult. And that alone was just sort of the input to the next part of the problem. All right, so just a quick wrap-up of maybe the talk or maybe the thesis in general. But there's this line planning problem that we've talked about. Here we've been able to use an arc flow formulation. We haven't had to resort to a path flow-based decomposition to actually come up with interesting solutions. And we've looked at some sort of integration with the line planning and timetabling. And there's this depot matching, so that consists of two different problems. There's the matching itself, but also the wider routing in the challenge. And there's also some robustness considerations that I haven't really talked about too much here. But in the context of robust rails, we've also thought a little bit about robustness in railway and tried to include some robustness in our line planning and especially in the timetabling. And looking to the future, I think we'd expect to see for sure more integrated planning and more maybe integrated considerations of robustness in rail. And this is the end of robust rails, the project, but hopefully there's going to be more robust considerations of rail planning at DTU or with DSB or in Denmark or in a wider context in the future. But I'll end the talk there, and thank you.